We remember empires dying with flags falling, crowds chanting, and statues being torn down. But sometimes, a superpower doesn't collapse on a battlefield. Sometimes it collapses on a spreadsheet. Because in the end, the most powerful weapon in history isn't a missile. It's a bill. A bill so large that even a nuclear empire can't pay it. On December 25, 1991, the Soviet flag came down for the last time. To the world, it looked like politics. Communism failing, democracy winning, a Cold War ending. But inside the Soviet Ministry of Finance, it looked like something colder. Bankruptcy. And the fuse that helped light that bankruptcy wasn't fired in Washington or Afghanistan. It was lit 5 years earlier in the dark, at 1:23 a.m. in Ukraine. Chernobyl, a disaster we remember as radiation, evacuation, sickness, and a poisoned landscape. But Chernobyl was also something else. It was a financial detonation. A blast that didn't just rupture a reactor vessel, it ruptured the budget of an already dying empire. Years later, Mikhail Gorbachev wrote that Chernobyl, more than his reforms, may have been the real cause of the Soviet collapse. That's a shocking statement. How does a nuclear accident kill a political system? Here's how. It empties the treasury. And when the treasury is empty, the empire becomes a ghost. The night was ordinary until it wasn't. Inside reactor number 4 at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, engineers prepared for a safety test, a routine procedure on paper. But the reactor was an RBMK, an enormous Soviet design, powerful and flawed in ways that would become legendary. The test went wrong. Then worse. Control rods dropped but not fast enough. Power surged. Fuel overheated. Pressure spiked. And then an explosion tore through the building like the earth itself had kicked upward. The roof blew off. Graphite burned. Fuel rods shattered. A radioactive plume rose into the sky, bright, invisible death drifting on the wind. And for the first moments, nobody understood what had happened. Not fully. Not even the people standing in the glow. The Soviet system ran on one fuel more important than oil, coal, or uranium. Control. Control of information. Control of panic. Control of reality. So, in the first hours after the explosion, the state did what it always did. It lied. Firefighters arrived without proper gear. Engineers walked through radiation as if it were smoke. Officials minimized, delayed, reframed. In the nearby city of Pripyat, built for the plant workers, 50,000 people slept as radioactive particles settled on balconies, playgrounds, and school windows. Children would wake up and play outside, and the government would still say nothing. Because at first, the Soviet Union wasn't fighting radiation. It was fighting embarrassment. And that delay, those precious hours and days, turned a crisis into a catastrophe, which would later turn into a financial black hole. A normal industrial accident has an endpoint. You put out the fire. You bury the wreckage. You rebuild. Chernobyl was different because it wasn't just destruction. It was contamination. A reactor core, exposed to the air, burning and releasing radiation like a chemical weapon. And if the Soviet state didn't stop it fast, it wouldn't just poison Ukraine. It would poison Europe. So the response wasn't a cleanup. It was mobilization. It was war. To contain Chernobyl, the USSR had to deploy resources on a scale normally reserved for invasion. And every decision came with a price tag. Not metaphorical. Literal, fuel, machinery, labor, concrete, steel, housing, medical care, logistics. Chernobyl required everything, and it demanded it immediately. The Soviet Union did not have an emergency fund for nuclear apocalypse. It had a rigid planned economy already under strain. And in 1986, timing could not have been worse, because this was the same year the Soviet cash lifeline collapsed. Oil. By the mid-1980s, the Soviet economy was sick. Factories were inefficient. Technology lagged. Agriculture couldn't reliably feed the population. Consumer shelves were already thin. But the USSR survived through one essential trick: export oil and gas for hard currency. That hard currency bought grain, machines, and stability. Then oil prices crashed. In 1986, the price of oil plunged from around $30 a barrel toward $10. The Soviet Union didn't just lose profit, it lost oxygen. Overnight, export revenue fell dramatically. Hard currency reserves shrank. The budget was bleeding, and then Chernobyl exploded. So now the USSR faced two disasters at once: a financial collapse and a radioactive war. The first urgent task was simple to describe and impossible to execute: stop the reactor from burning. So the Soviet state mobilized aviation. Helicopters flew over the glowing core, again and again, dumping sand, lead, boron, anything that could smother the reaction. Every sortie cost fuel. Every sortie contaminated equipment. Some helicopters became radioactive after only a few flights. They couldn't be reused. They were abandoned in graveyards, fields of poisoned metal. It was like throwing aircraft into a furnace. And this was only the opening act. Chapter 7, The Evacuation That Never Ends. Then came Pripyat, an entire city emptied in hours. Buses had to be dragged from across Ukraine. Routes planned, people moved, panic controlled. But you can't just evacuate 50,000 people and call it done. They need homes, jobs, schools, food, clothes, medical monitoring. The Soviet government had to build replacement housing, entire new settlements. Later, they would build Slavutich, a brand new city for plant workers and evacuees. A city created because another one became uninhabitable. Every apartment was a cost. Every school was a cost. Every road was a cost. And these costs didn't end in 1986. They lasted for decades. Around Chernobyl, a 30-kilometer zone became forbidden, fenced, guarded, abandoned. Farms died, factories shut, villages vanished. Land that produced wheat and milk turned into a liability. This wasn't just tragedy, it was economic amputation. Imagine carving out a chunk of your productive territory and saying, "This will never earn again." Then add maintenance, guards, monitoring, decontamination. It's not a one-time loss, it's a permanent drain. And then came the men, the liquidators. Over 600,000 people across the USSR would eventually be involved in cleanup operations. Soldiers, miners, engineers, construction crews, drivers, medics. They were sent into the most contaminated environment on Earth. Some to wash buildings, some to bury topsoil, some to dig trenches, some to shovel radioactive debris off the reactor roof. And because the work was deadly, the state had to pay them more. Bonuses, hazard pay, housing priority, early retirement, healthcare promises. Chernobyl was not just an expense in the moment. It was a welfare obligation that would echo for generations. Soviet officials began tallying. In 1986 alone, direct costs were estimated in the billions of rubles. By the end of the decade, estimates climbed toward 18 billion rubles. That number matters because it's not large. It's structural. It's the kind of number that changes political destiny. When you spend the equivalent of enormous slices of national capability on one disaster, you don't just lose money. You lose time. You lose reform. You lose future. And the Soviet Union in 1986 had no future to spare. Here's the nightmare. Chernobyl demanded spending. Oil collapse removed income. The USSR could not simply raise taxes. People were already struggling. It couldn't borrow easily forever. So it did the most dangerous thing a fragile system can do. It printed. The ruble press began to spin faster, to pay wages, to pay bonuses, to pay for concrete, steel, transport, to keep the machine running. But printing money doesn't create goods, it creates pressure. In a shortage economy, it creates chaos. And once chaos starts, it spreads. When the world imagines Chernobyl, it imagines one explosion. One moment, one flash. But Chernobyl wasn't one moment, it was a sustained event. A reactor core exposed to open air, graphite burning like a furnace, radiation rising like smoke you can't see. The Soviet leadership realized something terrifying. They weren't fighting a normal accident. They were fighting an open nuclear wound, and wounds don't close on their own. So they did what the Soviet state always did when faced with an existential threat. They threw manpower at it, then more manpower, then the entire machinery of a superpower. The plan became simple in concept, insane in execution. Bury Reactor 4. Seal it inside concrete and steel. Create a massive structure that would lock the radioactive core away from the world. The result would be called the sarcophagus. But calling it a structure doesn't capture what it really was. It was a rushed monument to emergency engineering. A tomb built in conditions where machines died, where metal became contaminated, where workers could not stay in place for minutes without absorbing dangerous doses. The sarcophagus required hundreds of thousands of cubic meters of concrete, thousands of tons of steel cranes, and heavy equipment operating near lethal radiation, and this had to happen fast. Because the longer the core remained exposed, the greater the chance of a secondary catastrophe. The Soviet Union didn't have time to design the perfect solution. It needed any solution, and any solution became extremely expensive. Soviet planners tried to use robots, remote-controlled equipment, machines that could do what humans couldn't, but the radiation was so intense that electronics simply stopped working. Circuits fried, motors seized, sensors died. In a normal industrial accident, technology solves problems. At Chernobyl, technology became another casualty. So the Soviets invented a term that sounds like something from a dystopian novel. They called the men who would replace the robots biorobots, humans. The most infamous job in the entire cleanup was on the roof. After the explosion, chunks of radioactive graphite and fuel debris were scattered across the rooftops of nearby buildings. And these pieces weren't just radioactive. They were lethal. This debris had to be removed because it was actively emitting radiation day and night into the environment. But no one could work up there for long, so the system was designed like a conveyor belt of flesh. A soldier would run onto the roof, shovel as much debris as possible into the pit below, then run back. The time limit was terrifyingly short. Sometimes 120 seconds, 90 seconds, less one short sprint in a toxic storm, one burst of labor. Then your lifetime exposure quota was reached, and the next man would run. Thousands cycled through, not because the USSR had an excess of people, but because it had no alternative. This was cleanup as human consumption, and every single one of those men created a future cost. Medical monitoring, disability claims, pensions, social welfare promises. Chernobyl wasn't just expensive because of concrete. It was expensive because it created a generation of liabilities. Here's the part that doesn't show up in dramatic reenactments. Those 600,000 liquidators weren't just soldiers. They were miners who could have produced coal, engineers who could have upgraded factories, mechanics who could have kept transport networks alive, construction workers who could have built housing elsewhere, farmers who could have worked the fields instead. They were in the zone, washing streets, digging trenches, burying contaminated soil, stacking concrete, shoveling poison. The Soviet economy was already stagnant. It was already underperforming. And now a massive chunk of its workforce was removed from productivity. This is what economists call opportunity cost. But in Chernobyl's case, it wasn't a theory. It was a gutting. Radiation doesn't respect borders. The plume drifted. Fallout moved with wind and rain. It landed not just around Chernobyl, but across Belarus, Russia, and beyond. And some of the worst contamination hit farmland. This mattered because Soviet agriculture was already fragile. The USSR had fertile regions, yes, especially Ukraine, but the system was inefficient. Harvest losses were massive. Distribution was broken, and the country still relied heavily on imported grain to feed its cities. Now imagine adding radioactive contamination to that fragile system. Milk became risky, meat became risky, crops became uncertain. Officials face choices no government wants to face. Do you destroy food and risk shortage? Or do you quietly mix contaminated supplies into the system and hope no one notices? The Soviet system, built on secrecy and survival, leaned into the second option. And every secret compromise created political rot. With farmland damaged and public trust collapsing, food imports became even more crucial. But imports require hard currency. Dollars, Deutschmarks, gold, not rubles. And 1986 wasn't just the year of Chernobyl. It was the year oil revenue collapsed. So the USSR faced a brutal equation: more food needed, less hard currency available. So what did it do? It borrowed from Western banks, the same rivals it spent decades condemning. That irony cut deep, and the numbers climbed. Soviet external debt rose sharply through the late 1980s. It wasn't borrowing to build new industries. It was borrowing to keep shelves from going fully empty, borrowing to maintain the illusion of stability, a superpower on life support. Chernobyl didn't just poison land, it poisoned a plan. The Soviet Union had viewed nuclear power as the key to its economic future. The logic was brutal but rational. Use nuclear energy for domestic electricity. Free up oil and gas for export. Export oil and gas for hard currency. Use hard currency to buy what the USSR couldn't produce. It was a pipeline of survival. Chernobyl ruptured that pipeline. After April 1986, nuclear power became politically toxic. Reactor construction slowed. Safety checks forced shutdowns. New builds were halted or delayed. And if nuclear power didn't expand, then oil and gas had to be burned at home to keep the system running, which meant less export revenue, which meant less hard currency, which meant less ability to buy grain and machines. Chernobyl didn't just cost billions, it crippled the USSR's ability to earn. The Soviet system was built on planning, 5-year plans, production targets, resource allocation charts, a belief that reality could be managed if the numbers were organized. Chernobyl destroyed that belief, because you can't plan for a nuclear explosion. Suddenly, concrete was diverted from other projects, trucks were diverted, skilled workers were diverted, factories, lost parts, construction sites, stalled, supply chains fractured. Emergency spending, containment, evacuation, construction. But soon the true cost emerged. Chernobyl became permanent. The zone had to be guarded forever. Health monitoring had to continue for decades. Compensation programs expanded. Medical claims grew. Resettlement remained unfinished. Every year the budget kept bleeding. And while the radioactive fire at Reactor 4 was contained, the financial fire kept burning. At first, Chernobyl looked like an emergency. Then it looked like a tragedy. Then it looked like a national trauma. But by the end of the 1980s, it looked like something far more dangerous to the Soviet system. A permanent line item, not an event, a cost, and costs demand payment. By 1989, the Soviet leadership could no longer pretend that Chernobyl was handled. The sarcophagus was standing, yes. The fires were out, yes. But the bills kept arriving. Medical care, resettlement, lost agricultural land, energy shortfalls, environmental monitoring, compensation claims. Chernobyl had mutated from a disaster into a chronic financial disease, and the state had no cure. In the first days after the explosion, Soviet officials made promises. Big promises. They had to. They were asking men to walk into radiation fields. They were asking families to abandon their homes forever. They were asking entire regions to sacrifice themselves for the survival of the state. So the government said, "You will be taken care of. Higher wages, early retirement, free health care, priority housing, guaranteed pensions." At the time, these promises felt manageable. After all, the Soviet Union was a superpower. What was a few 100,000 people? What Moscow didn't understand was that Chernobyl didn't affect a few 100,000. It affected millions. By 1990, political pressure forced the Supreme Soviet to formalize compensation. The result was a series of laws often called the Chernobyl laws. They dramatically expanded who qualified as a victim. Not just liquidators, not just evacuees, but anyone living in contaminated zones. Teachers, farmers, factory workers, children, pensioners. Entire regions were suddenly eligible for benefits, and the costs exploded. In Belarus, one of the smallest Soviet republics, the fallout was devastating. Nearly a quarter of its territory was contaminated. By the early 1990s, up to 20% of the republic's annual budget was going to Chernobyl-related expenses. One disaster was consuming one-fifth of a government's finances. And Belarus wasn't alone. Ukraine and Russia faced similar pressures. The Soviet center was supposed to absorb the burden, but Moscow was already bankrupt. The Soviet system depended on one principle: the center provides, the republics obey. But after Chernobyl, the center became the liability. Moscow didn't bring prosperity, it brought contamination, it brought secrecy, and it brought unpaid promises. As compensation claims grew, the central budget hemorrhaged. The government responded the only way it could: it printed money. Rubles flowed into the economy without goods to absorb them. And the result wasn't prosperity, it was monetary decay. By the late 1980s, Soviet citizens noticed something strange. They had more money, but less to buy. Paychecks increased, bonuses appeared, compensation payments arrived, but the shops were empty, the shelves were bare. Money had become something you wanted to get rid of as fast as possible. People stopped saving. They stopped trusting the future. They hoarded goods instead. If you saw sugar, you bought sugar. If you saw shoes, you bought shoes. If you saw meat, you didn't ask questions. This wasn't irrational behavior. It was rational distrust. If the state could lie about radiation, it could lie about money. For decades, the Soviet Union survived on a myth. The myth wasn't prosperity, it was competence. The state knew what it was doing. The party protected the people. The system worked even if it wasn't comfortable. Chernobyl destroyed that myth, not slowly, instantly. The government delayed evacuation. It concealed information. It exposed children to radioactive parades. And then it failed to pay for the consequences. Once that lie collapsed, everything else followed. Why trust the plan? Why trust the numbers? Why trust the future? Ironically, Chernobyl accelerated glasnost, openness. Because secrecy had failed so catastrophically, journalists began publishing data. Doctors spoke openly about illnesses. Scientists contradicted official statements. Environmental movements emerged. And they weren't just technical protests. They were political revolutions in disguise. Because environmental damage doesn't respect ideology. Radiation doesn't care about Marxism. And poisoned soil doesn't care about 5-year plans. Nowhere was the political fallout stronger than in Ukraine. Chernobyl was on Ukrainian soil, but decisions came from Moscow. Electricity flowed into the Soviet grid, but radiation stayed local. Ukrainians began to see Chernobyl not as an accident, but as imperial exploitation. The central government built the reactor. The central government lied. The central government failed to pay. And the central government demanded continued loyalty. Environmental protests became nationalist protests. Demands for clean land became demands for sovereignty. Chernobyl radicalized Ukraine faster than any ideology ever could. The argument became brutally simple. Why send our tax money to Moscow? To fund disasters we didn't choose. To pay for promises that aren't kept. If we controlled our own budget, we could clean this up ourselves. Independence wasn't romantic. It was fiscal survival. Beyond the Soviet borders, satellites watched closely. Poland, Hungary, East Germany. They saw a superpower struggling to pay bills. They saw an empire distracted. They saw a Kremlin too broke to send tanks. And tanks cost money. Chernobyl didn't just poison land. It poisoned deterrence. The empire could no longer afford repression. When the Berlin Wall fell, it wasn't because the Soviet army was defeated. It was because the Soviet treasury was empty. An invasion costs fuel, logistics, maintenance, political fallout. Chernobyl had drained the reserve needed to enforce empire, and the satellites knew it. By 1990, the Soviet Union had no buffer left, no financial cushion, no legitimacy reserve, no credibility. The economy was running on fumes. Oil revenue was still low, debt was rising, inflation was accelerating, and Chernobyl kept demanding payment. The state had built reactors, but never budgeted for failure. It had built missiles, but never insured its people. The men who saved the country were getting sick: cancer, heart disease, disability. They demanded what they were promised: health care, pensions, recognition. And when payments failed, they organized. The Chernobyl Union became one of the first independent mass movements in the USSR. The heroes were suing the state, a government being sued by its saviors. That image was devastating. By 1991, the math was undeniable. The Soviet Union could not pay its soldiers, feed its cities, maintain its empire, honor its promises. Chernobyl was no longer a cause. It was evidence. Evidence that the system had no margin for error, and modern life is nothing but errors waiting to happen. In August 1991, tanks rolled into Moscow. To the outside world, it looked like a classic coup. Hardline communists, military vehicles, an attempt to stop reform. But behind the drama was a quieter truth. The coup leaders weren't trying to save socialism. They were trying to save the balance sheet. They believed that if they removed Gorbachev, restored discipline, and shut down openness, the system could be stabilized. What they didn't understand was this: you can arrest politicians, you can censor newspapers, you can deploy tanks, but you cannot censor accounting, and you cannot imprison debt. The coup leaders had no plan, no money, no reserves. They couldn't pay workers, they couldn't pay soldiers, they couldn't pay for food deliveries. The economy was already fractured beyond command. Factories were idle. Supply chains were broken. Republics were withholding taxes, and above it all hovered the shadow of Chernobyl, a disaster that still demanded billions. The coup collapsed not because of resistance alone, but because the state it tried to seize was already hollow. Just days after the coup failed, Ukraine moved. On August 24, 1991, the Ukrainian parliament declared independence. This wasn't just nationalism, it was triage. Ukraine had absorbed the worst of the fallout, the worst of the contamination, the worst of the lies, and it had paid the highest price. Ukrainian leaders understood something fundamental. Remaining in the Soviet Union meant inheriting an unpayable bill. Leaving meant at least controlling their own future. The reactor had turned sovereignty into a survival issue. In December 1991, Ukrainians voted. Over 90% chose independence, not because of ideology, because of memory. They remembered the silence. They remembered the delayed evacuation. They remembered children marching under radioactive rain. Chernobyl stood as proof that the center could not be trusted with life itself. On Christmas Day, Mikhail Gorbachev resigned. The red flag was lowered from the Kremlin. To the world, it looked like a peaceful end. To economists, it looked like a default. The Soviet Union didn't collapse, it was liquidated. Assets were divided, borders were redrawn, debts were inherited, and liabilities remained. Russia inherited. The UN seat, the nuclear arsenal, the foreign debt Ukraine and Belarus inherited. The land, the fallout, the poisoned fields, the sick citizens, the bill for Chernobyl was split unevenly. And no one wanted to pay it. The 1990s were brutal. Supply chains collapsed. Inflation exploded. Savings vanished. For Chernobyl victims, it was catastrophic. The compensation laws became meaningless. Pensions were destroyed by hyperinflation. Healthcare systems collapsed. The heroes of 1986 became liabilities in 1992. They were honored in speeches and abandoned in reality. Belarus suffered more radioactive contamination than Ukraine. Yet it was smaller, poorer, less able to absorb the cost. Nearly 25% of its land was contaminated. Entire regions were permanently impaired. For decades, Belarus spent massive portions of its budget on radiation monitoring, healthcare, and compensation. This wasn't recovery, it was survival. The concrete tomb built in 1986 was never meant to last. It was rushed, improvised, built under impossible conditions. By the 1990s, cracks appeared, rainwater leaked in, structural integrity declined. Experts warned, if the sarcophagus collapsed, another radioactive cloud could be released. But Ukraine had no money. Russia had no money. The Soviet Union was gone, and its insurance policy didn't exist. In the end, the former superpower had to beg. Ukraine appealed to the West, to the United States, to Europe, to former enemies. The argument was blunt. If this collapses, it will affect everyone. And the world listened. The new safe confinement project was born, a massive steel arch built to slide over the reactor. Cost over $2 billion. Funded not by the Soviet Union, but by the international community. The empire that once terrified the world could no longer afford to clean up its own disaster. That was the final verdict. Years later, Gorbachev reflected. He said Chernobyl mattered more than perestroika, more than Afghanistan, more than arms races. Why? Because Chernobyl exposed the system's weakest point. It couldn't handle complexity, it couldn't handle uncertainty, and it couldn't afford mistakes. The Soviet Union was built to endure war. It was not built to endure failure. Chernobyl was not an enemy. It was an error, and errors require transparency, adaptability, and reserves. The USSR had none. The Soviet Union could build reactors, but it couldn't insure them. It could build missiles, but it couldn't compensate victims. It could control territory, but it couldn't control consequences. And consequences are always more expensive than intentions. Today, Pripyat stands frozen, apartments abandoned, schools silent, the Ferris wheel rusting, not just a monument to radiation, but to economic failure. Because no system that collapses can afford cleanup. Chernobyl didn't cause the collapse alone, but it removed the margin for survival. The empire was already weakened. The explosion finished the accounting. Assets, territory, weapons, ideology, liabilities. Debt, contamination, broken trust, unpaid promises, the liabilities won. Empires don't die from explosions. They die from bills. They die when systems become too complex to manage and too expensive to fix. Chernobyl was not just a reactor failure. It was a financial autopsy. The radiation is still there. The costs are still being paid. And the lesson still stands. A state that cannot afford the truth cannot survive reality. Thank you for watching. If you want to understand how economies rise and fall, how wealth is created and destroyed, and what history's greatest cautionary tales teach us about our own time, make sure to subscribe. These patterns repeat, and understanding them might be the most valuable knowledge you can possess. We'll see you in the next one.